Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
Unfortunately, the defense did not order those phone records. They were ordered by the prosecution many, many months later, and they didn't have all of Brandon's records. So all of the phone records were having to be pieced together by phone calls that he had made to other people by those phones that we knew he had called that day.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensy.
Hello, American Justice Army. Welcome back to your podcast. Last week, when we left off, we were just starting to get into the timeline of that fateful hour that the special prosecutor, Mr. Ralph Guerrero, said that Brandon was unaccounted for from 9:30 to 10:30 p.m. Just to recap, Brandon's mom, Norma, was reported to have been on the phone with her mother, Brandon's grandmother, Opal Johnston, until about 9:30 p.m. Brandon had a rock-solid alibi from around 11 p.m. on that night, and even up until the bodies were found. So, if the prosecutors were going to have to mold that clay into the Brandon did it shape that they were looking for, they were going to have to somehow prove that he had time to commit these horrible atrocities sometime between 9:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. So, with that said, let's get into the forensics of the phone calls. We're focusing this week on the time between 9:30, when Brandon's mom, Norma, was assumed to be alive, and the time that he met up with Robert at Denny's, which, as we'll show later on, is around 11 p.m. From that point on, he was with his friends until the bodies were found. So his alibi from that Denny's rendezvous on has never been questioned. So the only time that Brandon even had to commit the crimes was between 9:30 p.m. and the time that he met up with Robert. I do want to reiterate something just to be clear. The reason we are focusing on these times is because the time before 9:30 p.m. and after the meetup at Denny's do not matter. Norma and Dennis were alive before 9:30. And Brandon had an alibi after Denny's. Okay, are we ready? Let's go. First, let's look at the prosecution's theory of when Brandon killed his parents. Here's an excerpt from one of the prosecutor's closing arguments at trial. You'll see that he talks about Brandon being unaccounted for between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. Here you go.
Ms. Ferguson talked a lot about the timeline, and I want to focus on that because that tells the story. His timeline is the only one that I can verify. Yes, they had a pizza about 6:30, 6:15. The defendant tells you that. You see the pizza box there, we're not disputing that. Yes, he left Roy's City around 6:30 or 7 o'clock. He says he then drove to Heath, took 23 minutes. Ms. Stern testified, yes, it takes that time to drive. He says he's at Heath for about 30 minutes and, quote, leaves at 8 o'clock at the latest. Never mentions going to see Morgan Lee at the Ag Barn during any of that time. And then we know that at 10:51 to 11, he's meeting Robert Martinez. What we don't know, if we stick to the defendant's timeline, is what he's doing between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. But we do know. And what we know, ladies and gentlemen, is that he leaves from 6 to 6:15. He leaves Royce City. He's at the Ag Barn. And between 9:30 and 10:30, he's unaccounted for. What we do know is from 9:41 to 10:34, he's not making any calls. He's being called a lot by people. 1 minute, less than 1 minute voicemail. You heard Robert Martinez say he didn't pick up his calls. 9:30 to 10:30. All the toll records after that is confirming his story. But what happens after 9:30 to 10:30 is not really in question. What's in question, ladies and gentlemen, is what's happening at that house. He does make that call at 7:30, and he calls them maybe to tell them, oh, I forgot the mail on the bed, or, oh, I forgot, my friend Robert is taking too long. I'm going to have to come back. He needs to give an explanation for why he's coming back in that house so he doesn't surprise them. And he comes back in that house, and he sits down on that couch, and they're watching TV for a little bit. Hey, I'm going to go to the restroom. And they're watching TV, and they're not looking at him. And he goes and he gets the dagger and the gun, which he had all day to hide under the bed or keep in a bag. And he comes back, and Mom and Dad are still watching that TV. And he just without, boom. And then boom, boom. And Norma is trying to protect herself and trying to get under Dennis. And she takes that shot to the hand, the 2 shots here. She spills over. He just takes a step to get in that 3rd shot that's downward. He gets the dagger, and he starts stabbing Dennis 9 times. Hits his mom once with the point as well. He walks away, and he's putting his shirt and covering up the dagger. And he puts it in the bag, whatever he's kept it in. Puts all that, takes off his clothes, puts them in there, gets in the shower. Then he uses the towels there. Maybe he brings his own towels. Gets in the car. The reason there's no blood in the truck is because he showered. He has all that stuff covered. Goes back to the house. You heard from Loons that he's there between 10:15. He gets there a little after 10 o'clock. He takes the dogs out probably around 10:30. Puts the dagger in there in that garage, or maybe he puts it in the garage and it got moved to the barn after the flood, or he puts it in the barn himself. On the way up to Dallas, plenty of opportunity to throw it in the lake, or maybe he keeps it all in that bag and discards it when he gets to ACU, which is why he freaks out when James and Alex are looking through his bag.
All right, let's talk about a few things that Mr. Guerrero told the jury. Just in that short clip, the special prosecutor at the very least misled the jury. After last week when we talked about the definition of the word lie so much, I can't say what was going through Mr. Guerrero's head. I can't say for a fact that he intentionally deceived the jury. What I can say, though, is that he should have known what he was saying was untrue. After all, he had all the same evidence I do. I didn't find anything new and exciting in Brandon's phone records. I just went back and looked at them the way that he and Ranger Collins should have, with an objective point of view. The first such example of misleading the jury is when he told them, in his closing arguments, quote, "You heard Robert Martinez say he didn't pick up his calls, 9:30 to 10:30, unquote. Now, let's look at Mr. Martinez's actual testimony earlier in the trial. Mr. Guerrero. So, between 9:49 and 10:51, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and that 10:51 call would be 11 calls. Mr. Martinez? Yes, sir. Mr. Guerrero. Of those 11 calls between you and the defendant between 9:49 and 10:51, how many of those calls are you to the defendant? Mr. Martinez? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Mr. Guerrero. 9 of the 11? Mr. Martinez. 9 out of the 11. Mr. Guerrero. Do you remember how many of those calls that you made, of the 9 that you made, where the defendant didn't pick up? Mr. Martinez. At least a couple. End of testimony. Now wait a minute. Mr. Guerrero just told the jury that Brandon did not pick up any of his calls. Yet, what Mr. Martinez actually testified to was that Brandon only didn't pick up a couple. Mr. Guerrero sounds like a politician trying to rewrite history. But don't worry, this would not be the only time. In fact, just a few breaths later, Mr. Guerrero states, quote, "And between 9:30 and 10:30, he's unaccounted for. What we do know is that from 9:41 to 10:34, he's not making any calls." End quote. Again, he's telling untruths that misled the jury in a devastating yet effective way. First, Brandon is not, quote, unaccounted for. We have him talking to people on the phone. We have that pesky neighbor, Randall Luns, that saw Brandon at the Heath house, etc. He may not have been tracked minute by minute, but he was definitely accounted for. The thing is that he says Brandon's not making any calls from 9:41 to 10:34. Once again, he's leading the jury down a road that is so far from the truth, they would never find their way back to Realityville. The obvious sentiment that he's trying to get through to the jury is that Brandon's not talking to anyone, that he's unaccounted for, not communicating with anyone. Basically, he's trying to paint the picture that Brandon is MIA from 9:41 until 10:34. Yet Brandon's receiving many calls during that time frame, many of them 2 minutes or more. I mean, if I came up missing and my friend Sean says, "Hey, I talked to Scott from 10:45 last night until 11:15, does it really matter if Sean called me or I called him? We were still talking for 30 minutes, right?" In this case, Brandon talks to Morgan for 3.5 minutes from 9:41 until 9:45. Then, according to Robert, Brandon talks to him at 9:49 p.m. for a minute. Now, between that 9:49 call when Brandon and Robert talk and that 10:34 phone call that Mr. Guerrero is talking about, there are 8 calls total. 5 of them are 1 minute or more. I don't know about you, but the last time I left a voicemail that lasted more than 10 seconds was many years ago. Most of the time, it sounds something like this. "Hey, it's Scott. I guess you're not picking up my calls. Why don't you ever pick up my calls? Who am I to you? Chopped liver? Come on, man. Call me back." Okay. That message right there was a little exaggerated, but even that was only 12 seconds long. So what I'm trying to show here is that if the call was 1 minute or more, it can be assumed that the two people were actually talking. That means that Brandon is talking to people for 5 out of 8 calls in the time frame that Mr. Guerrero is trying to establish Brandon is MIA. All it would have taken was a little effort on the part of the investigators and the prosecution to realize the flaw in the phone records theory. Now, I've never attended law school, or the police academy for that matter, but basic high school level word problems forced me to combine multiple elements to determine answers during every state mandated test I've ever had the displeasure of taking. All of them. I also believe a basic high school education with passing grades is required to attend either of those pathways of higher education. So with that being said, a lack of education could not have been the problem with the investigators and the prosecutors' flaws in logic. That only leaves laziness. Or, well, I think you see where I'm going with that. However, let's get to the most important part of all of this, the actual time that Brandon had the opportunity to kill his parents. As I said earlier, it only matters what Brandon was doing between 9:30 p.m. and when he met up with Robert, which we're now learning is between 10:51 p.m. and 11 p.m. Let's just call it 11 p.m. to be the most fair to the prosecution. I think it's very important that we go over it in detail because at the end of it, you'll realize that Brandon's, quote, murder window is a lot less than you may think. Before we get into the actual phone calls, I want to do a little experiment. I'm going to give you a list of all the things that the killer had to have done that night, according to the evidence. Once I get done listing all of the things he or she had to have done, I want you to mentally think to yourself, how much time would it take a 19-year-old kid to do all of these things? Then, after we get done talking about all the phone calls, we'll see how your guess coincides with the actual murder window. I'm going to be supposing that this was a single killer, even though when we talk about the crime scene forensics, it will be shown that there was more than one killer. The state's theory is that it was Brandon, and Brandon alone. So in the playing devil's advocate role, I'll be assuming in all of these activities that it was just one perpetrator. Just a quick warning, just as I warned you when we talked about the crime scene in the first episode, we're going to be talking about the crime scene again. Those of you with weak stomachs may want to, well, take some antacid because you won't want to miss this. All right, ready? Here we go. Both Dennis and Norma Woodruff were shot and stabbed. Dennis shot once, Norma shot 3 times. Dennis was stabbed 9 times, and Norma was stabbed 5. Okay, so you just shot and stabbed 2 people to death. Now what do you have to do? You need to clean up, right? I mean, this was a horrifically bloody crime scene. There were pools and pools of blood, along with blood spatter all over the couch and the makeshift cardboard box that turned into a coffee table. There was blood spatter all along the Venetian blinds behind the couch. Let's just say it was pretty bad. All right, so you need to clean up. The crime scene photos show that there was blood dripping all the way from the couch to the guest bathroom, approximately 15 to 20 feet away. So the perpetrator had to carry the murder weapons all the way from the couch to the bathroom. Now, even though we haven't gotten there yet, there would be no blood or any DNA found on Brandon's clothes, in his truck, in his mom's truck. Basically nothing found on anything that he was wearing that night. So the prosecutors had to contend that Brandon took a shower in that bathroom with the blood that was leading all the way up to it. So he would have had to have gone in the bathroom, completely stripped down naked, jump in the shower, wash himself off of all the blood that had just been strewn about during the commission of the murders, and then get out and dry off. Now, there was actually a towel found hanging from the curtain rod above the shower when the investigators showed up. It was also tested for DNA, and nothing was found. So either Brandon spent so long in the shower that he literally washed away every single molecule of his parents' blood, or that towel was just not the one that he used to dry off, and for some reason decided to hang a different towel over the shower rod when he left. Okay, so now he gets out of the shower. The problem now is that there must be a significant amount of blood actually in the bathroom. Remember, the perpetrator was dripping blood, either from his clothing or from the murder weapons, all the way to the bathroom. Blood doesn't just magically stop dripping once you reach the threshold of a bathroom. So there had to be a significant amount of blood on the bathroom floor, presumably on the door handle, and on the bathroom sink, and of course, all over the bathtub that he just took a shower in. So now, he has to clean the bathroom so well that there would not be one drop. Yes, you heard that right. Not one drop of blood found in the bathroom. Somehow, he would have had to go to the laundry room to get the cleaning products without getting any blood on him, even though he would have had to have traveled right through the bloody crime scene that he just created in order to get to the laundry room. Okay, so let's just suppose that Brandon was able to levitate over the bloody floor and get to the laundry room, get the cleaning products, levitate back over the living room floor to get back to the bathroom. Now he has to meticulously clean the bathroom. Remember, not one drop of blood found. That means that he's got to scrub down the sink, the bathtub, the door handle, probably the door itself, etc. He has to really clean that bathroom well. I mean, since most of you are true crime aficionados such as myself, how many times have you heard about an actual killer trying to clean a crime scene that only to have some blood found later during the investigation? From what I've been able to gather about cleaning a bloody room, it ain't easy. Hopefully, I'll never have the chance to find out. So how long do you think it takes to clean the bathroom that well? Are you still adding up the total time in your head? Good. Remember, there's a quiz at the end of all of this. Okay. So the killer then cleans the bathroom well and ends up on the outside of the threshold while wiping the last bit from the bathroom floor. But now you have a problem. You've just walked past the bloody crime scene. You've been cleaning floors and sinks and bathtubs with blood all over it, and now you have to somehow get the bloody rags and the gun and the 18-inch sword into a bag to make sure that no blood gets on your clothes. Oh crap, clothes. You're still naked. How do you get clothes on without getting blood all over them? Remember, you still have to pick up the murder weapons and the bloody clothes to get them into the bag. Sure, he could have put them in the bag before he took a shower, but then you're going to have blood all over your hands. So you're going to have to presumably get blood all over the outside of the bag that you just put everything into. That wouldn't work, because then you'd transfer the blood to the seat or the floorboard once you got in the truck. So yes, you better bag them after, when you're all clean. Oh wait. The supposed murder weapon that was found was cleaned off. I almost forgot about that. So now we have to take the 18-inch sword to the kitchen sink and clean it off. Oh crap. There's that pesky, bloody living room floor again. Oh well. By this time, Brandon has been able to teach himself how to levitate. So he gets to the kitchen, washes off the sword, and puts it into a separate bag, and then the gun and clothes into a separate bag as well. Alright, awesome. We've now cleaned up. We put the blood-stained murder weapon and the blood-soiled clothes into one bag, and the newly washed-off 18-inch sword into another bag. Out the door we go. Okay, did you get that mental timeline in your head? Did you add up all the minutes you thought it would take for someone to do all of that by themselves? Normally, this would be where we just stop and compare notes. However, the prosecution didn't stop there. They went on to make the assertion that Brandon drove to the Heath house and hid the murder weapon in the back barn. This would be a great time to take a small detour on our road determining Brandon's timeline. Don't worry, it won't be a long one. We'll get back to the task at hand soon enough. There are several things about the alleged murder weapon that was found in the Heath barn. This will be just the first thing we cover about it. The prosecution theorized that after Brandon finished slaughtering his parents and cleaning up the crime scene, he drove to Heath and hid the sword in the building behind the Heath house. I've seen videos of this building, and even though everyone seems to keep calling it a barn, I think it resembles more of just a big storage building. When I think of a barn, I think of stables for horses and places to put stuff like that. The videos show pretty much just a big building with a lot of stuff. Boxes mostly, but also a few pieces of furniture and the like. Pretty much it just looks like what most people's cluttered garage looks like. Let me see if I can set the scene for you. Here's a reenactment of part of the trial transcript when Brandon's defense attorney, Catherine Ferguson, was questioning one of the investigators who originally searched the quote-unquote barn. From the way I've been talking about it, you might be thinking to yourself that the investigators who searched the barn at the time of the crime found the supposed murder weapon. Once again, things aren't always as they seem. This sword was actually not found until right around 2.5 years later. So then you might be thinking, oh, they just didn't search the barn? No, they did. They just didn't have time to look through everything. I mean, it's only a capital murder investigation. Surely they had time to move some boxes around. Okay, here's Catherine with an expert cross-examination finding out why they didn't search everything.
And Mr. Guerrero asked you that some areas of the barn, quote unquote, weren't accessible?
Yes.
They weren't accessible only because you didn't make an effort to gain access. Isn't that correct?
Not necessarily.
Well, was there a locked door to keep you from getting in the barn?
No.
Was it just boxes on the floor, piled, stacked up in a stall?
There were boxes on the floor. There was debris in the stalls to the point that debris almost overrode the stalls.
All right. Did that debris weigh 2,000 to 3,000 pounds?
Collectively, it's possible it could have. There was a lot.
Was it all glued together in one big lump?
No.
All right. Do you know how to work a broom?
Yes.
And a dustpan?
Yes.
Do you know how to fill trash bags?
Yes.
So if you had wanted to gain access to those stalls, you could have done it.
Taking everything out and going through every single thing, it's possible.
Did you see anything in there that would have made it physically impossible for you to inventory the contents of the barn October 22nd, 2005?
I don't believe it could have all been done on October, on that specific day.
Okay. It may have taken a day or two, correct?
Yes.
So there you have it. The investigators searched the barn, just not thoroughly. Did they find a murder weapon? Nope. They said they looked through everything that was readily accessible. All right, I told you all of that to tell you this. What the investigators are telling you is that if it was in the barn at the time that the prosecutors said Brandon hid it, then it was not in a place that was easily found. That would mean that he had to basically move a bunch of boxes to the side, put it in a box somewhere around the bottom of the pile, and then stack those boxes back up on top of the one that he just put the sword in. How long do you think that would take? Because however long you think that would take, you would need to add that to the time that you added up earlier when we described what the killer did at the crime scene. Remember, Ralph Guerrero, in going through his timeline, said that Brandon not only hid the sword in the barn, but then, on the way to Dallas, stopped and threw the bag with the gun and clothes over the bridge into Lake Ray Hubbard. So, add that time in as well. All right. It is now time to reveal all of the minutes or hours that you've been actively adding up. So, just to summarize, we have all the activities at the crime scene: shooting and stabbing both the victims, taking a shower, cleaning up the bathroom, levitating, etc. Then hiding the sword in the cluttered barn, and of course, stopping along the major interstate freeway to get out and throw a bloody gun and some bloody clothes over the bridge. Okay, do you have your final answer? How long would all of that take? Do you need to phone a friend? Remember, Ralph Guerrero says that Brandon was unaccounted for an hour. 9:30 to 10:30, remember? If you're watching this on YouTube, I want you to comment below what your total time was. Did you think that a 19-year-old college freshman could do all of that in an hour? What if I told you the actual time was only 45 minutes? How about now? Less likely that he could do all of that in that time frame, huh? What about 30 minutes? Are we getting tighter? Still possible, even though less likely, right? How about 20 minutes? Could he be the most time-efficient double homicide assassin ever known to man? What if I told you the actual time that Brandon had to do all of that was only 14 minutes? And what if I told you that one of the major contributing factors to Brandon being convicted was because Ralph Guerrero told the jury so many things that just simply were not true? He made it, quote, seem like Brandon was unaccounted for a whole hour. He actually said the words, 9:30 to 10:30, he is unaccounted for. Remember that? He knew good and well, or at the very least should have known, that Brandon was not MIA for an hour. It was only 14 minutes in the best case scenario for the prosecution that Brandon was not in contact with anyone. Okay, now let's prove it. I don't say things like this lightly. I do not make accusations without having proof. Here we go. Remember when we talked about 14 hours of Brandon's phone records being missing in last week's episode? This is where it comes into play in a significant way. But remember, we have other people's phone records to reconstruct Brandon's phone calls. So here's what we know. The first call we'll look at is one that Morgan Lee made to Brandon at 9:41 p.m. That call is 3.5 minutes long. So that takes us to 9:45. You also heard last week that Robert Martinez testified that he talked to Brandon at 9:49 p.m. for 1 minute to tell him that he was heading to Denny's from Denton. So now we know that Brandon is on the phone talking to people until at least 9:50 p.m. Now, in order to pinpoint the latest time that Brandon could have left the Royce City house, we have to actually work backwards. It gets a little involved, so please stay with me, but I promise I'll try to lay it out in as simple terms as possible. Okay. The phone records turned over to the defense finally start picking up Brandon's cell phone tower at 10:46 p.m. The cell towers show him at 5123 Northwest Drive in Mesquite, Texas. Google shows the drive time between the Heath house and that cell tower as 19 minutes. As the state's prosecutor testified, it takes at least 23 minutes to drive from the Royce City house to the Heath house. So that means the very last minute that Brandon could have left the Heath house to get to that cell tower is 10:27 p.m. Are you with me so far? So if Brandon arrived at the Heath house at 10:27, literally drove up long enough for Randall Lunds to see him, and then turned back around and left immediately, that means that Brandon had to have left the Royce City house 23 minutes earlier. So basically what I'm saying is that for Brandon to finish doing all of the stuff we talked about, he would have to drive from Royce City at 10:04 p.m. in order to arrive at the Heath house at 10:27 p.m. So, if Brandon talked to someone at 9:50, but he had to leave by 10:04, that means that Brandon had 14 minutes to hang up with Robert, shoot and stab both of his parents, clean up in the... well, you get it. We've gone over that a few times already. But there you have it. I just proved to you that Brandon only had 14 minutes to do all of the things that we talked about. Now, let's talk about why Ranger Collins not turning over the original phone records from the phone companies is such a big deal. It's that one call at 9:41 p.m. between Brandon and Morgan. If Brandon was at the Royce City house, then yes, Brandon literally had 14 minutes to do all of the things that we talked about. However, if Brandon was at the Heath house, like he said he was, that would mean that he would have to drive back to the Royce City house, and as we discussed, that takes 23 minutes. 23 minutes after 9:45 is 10:08. Even if everything was as Mr. Guerrero said about Brandon's timeline, I just showed you that Brandon had to have left the Royce City house by 10:04. That's what we call an impossibility, ladies and gentlemen. It's impossible to leave somewhere by 10:04 if you don't even get there until 10:08. Well, unless you're Chris Angel or something. As we talked about earlier, Brandon has learned how to levitate, so maybe he knows how to go back in time. This is why the missing records are so much a key to this case. It's the one piece of evidence that if it actually existed, and it showed Brandon at the Heath house during that 9:41 call, that would completely and unequivocally exonerate Brandon Dale Woodruff for the murders of his parents. Now, if you're Ranger Collins and you get those phone records and you realize that it showed Brandon at the Heath house at 9:45, you would then immediately realize you have the wrong guy. What to do, what to do, what to do. Okay. Listen to me very carefully. It is not the position of this podcast or the host that Ranger Collins destroyed those phone records between 8:54 a.m. and 10:46 p.m. that were missing from Brandon's records. I'm only presenting to you the facts and allowing you to make up your own mind. What I do know is that October 16th, 2005 was the only day that had any phone calls noticeably missing from Brandon's records. The reason I said in last week's episode that, quote, as I have been able to analyze the phone calls, is because there's no way to tell if there's a random call missing here or there. Could there have been one missing in the middle of a day 3 weeks prior? Sure. Would it be noticeable? No. That's what makes this so egregious. It should have been noticed that there was 14 hours missing in Brandon's calls on the day of the murders. Ranger Collins even notes it in his investigative report. Remember that? But I mean, really, Ranger Collins? 14 hours missing on the day of the murders and you don't find that worthy of further investigation? I mean, he had the other records. He could have very easily flipped through the pages in his hands and seen, oh, hey, looky there. Morgan talked to Brandon at 9:41, but there's no record of it on Brandon's calls. Maybe I should look into that some more. but Ranger Collins was too eager to prove how Brandon was, quote, lying to him. Here's a couple of things I know. I know that when the records were finally turned over to the defense, they were in a Microsoft Excel file. I also know how easy it is to delete a few rows from a spreadsheet. Am I saying that's what happened here? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But one thing I do know for a fact is that if they would have just turned over the phone records in the raw format from the phone companies, we wouldn't be talking about this right now. All right. You may be wondering to yourself right about now, what happened with all the other phone calls between 9:41 and 10:34, like Mr. Guerrero was speaking about? Remember, he made it out to the jury like Brandon was unreachable during that time. Let's look at each one. After that 9:49 call when Robert and Brandon talked, the next call was from Robert to Brandon at 10:09 p.m. That was under a minute. Okay, we'll give Mr. Guerrero the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say that one went to voicemail and Brandon didn't answer. That's one of the couple that Robert said Brandon didn't pick up. Next, there's a 10:10 call from Morgan to Brandon for a little under 2 minutes. I'm sorry, Mr. Guerrero, but we're going to have to assume that if Morgan and Brandon were connected for almost 2 minutes, they had to have talked about something. I don't ever remember leaving a 2-minute voicemail, and I don't think it would be reasonable of you to ask my audience to believe it either. Next, Robert calls Brandon at 10:15 p.m., and the phone call this time lasts over 2 minutes. There's one of the calls that Robert talks about where Brandon actually picked up. Next up, 10:19 p.m. from Morgan to Brandon for under a minute. Okay, we'll let you say that Brandon didn't pick up that one either. All right, at 10:22, Robert calls Brandon again. This time, for almost exactly 1 minute. We have to remember what's going on at this point. Brandon and Robert are connecting basically just to say, okay, I'm coming, or okay, what road do I take? Or how far away from Denny's are you? That type of thing. All right. 10:28. Yep, Robert calls Brandon again, this time over 2 minutes. Once again, a conversation for sure. Next up, 10:32 p.m., this time under a minute. Okay, there's the second of the two calls that Robert said didn't get answered. And then, of course, the 10:34 call that Mr. Guerrero referred to, where Brandon made his first outgoing call during this time. This call was to Alex Ruley for over 2 minutes. Okay, so now between that call at 10:34 and the 10:51 call that Robert testified was the last call between him and Brandon before Brandon arrived at Denny's, there's 7 calls, 6 of them over a minute. This is the reason that Mr. Guerrero said it didn't matter what happened after 10:30. But again, he portrayed to the jury that Brandon was unreachable from 9:30 to 10:30. Probably the biggest untruth that got Brandon convicted. Wow, what a piece of...
Y'all make me sick!
All right, so to wrap up, what have we learned this week? We learned that Brandon had almost 14 hours missing from the phone calls turned over to the defense. We know that the phone calls were not the raw records directly from the phone companies. We learned that Brandon had only 14 minutes where he was truly, quote, unaccounted for, but Ralph Guerrero presented it to the jury like it was an hour. We also learned that If Brandon was to commit all of these acts alleged by the prosecution, he would have to be the most time-efficient assassin ever to roam the face of the earth. Or a magician. One or the other. So what do you think? Do you think Brandon could have done all of that in 14 minutes? Do you think that the phone records were just ironically and innocently missing? I guess I can tell you what I think in one of my patent-pending Scott Pogency personal opinions. When I first started researching this case, I kept thinking to myself, there has to be something somewhere that made them arrest Brandon, and made them try him, and gave them reason to convict him. After all of the thousands of hours I put in poring over every last letter on every last page and every last minute of every last video, I sat back in my chair and thought to myself, holy shit, they got an innocent guy. That was a horrible realization in itself. But then, when I started going back through everything with a fine-tooth comb and really analyzing and studying the forensic evidence and the investigation itself, nothing made me more sick to my stomach than when I realized these phone records were not turned over to the defense. I can definitely see why Brandon was so upset when he learned that these calls were not turned over. That was his one get out of jail card. That was the one thing that he could point to that forensically and definitively showed that he was innocent. There was no DNA thanks to the Cracker Jack investigation that was done. There were no eyewitnesses that saw someone else going into the house that night. This is a very circumstantial case. In my opinion, the reason the jury was able to convict Brandon was because there just wasn't a, quote, smoking gun pointing to someone else. The police and the prosecution are standing here telling me, hey, Brandon's guilty, so he must be guilty. This one piece, the phone records, were the one thing that Brandon relied on to prove his innocence. It was the state's job to get and collect and disseminate these records. Yet once again, the police and the courts and the state of Texas let Brandon down. There will be other letdowns and places where the system failed Brandon, and we'll talk about those in upcoming episodes. But this was it. This was the one. And the fact that, to me, Ranger Collins was more intent on proving Brandon guilty than finding the truth is just inexcusable. I hope his conscience eats at him every night when he goes to bed and every morning when he wakes up. That is, if he has a conscience. All right, rant over. Next week, we'll finish up the interrogation that Brandon had with Ranger Collins, and we'll get to the arrest warrant. That's going to be a fun one. You don't want to miss it. Here's a little preview. Until next week, stay aware, stay strong, and get involved. Talk to you then.
Based on the facts listed above, affiant believes that enough probable cause exists for the issuance of an arrest warrant for Brandon Woodruff for the offense of capital murder for the deaths of Norma and Dennis Woodruff. Jeffrey T. Collins, affiant, subscribed and sworn before me on this, the 24th day of October A.D. 2005, Kenneth Peters, Magistrate, Hunt County, Texas.
The American Justice Podcast is owned and copyrighted by Atua Productions, LLC. Your host is Scott Pogency, and your writer is C. Derick Miller. The theme music for the American Justice Podcast has been created and composed by Josh DeRosa. Scripted and recorded episodes are published every Sunday morning, with follow-up Q&A episodes released on Fridays. You can find the Q&A episodes on YouTube by searching for American Justice Podcast. Atua Productions aims for this to be an interactive podcast where you, the audience, has a great amount of influence on the content of our shows. You can interact with us in several ways. First, and most preferred, is you can leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 942-942-0444. Be sure to leave your name and the city you're calling from, along with whether or not we can use your voice on the air. If Facebook is more your style, you can log on to our Facebook page at facebook.com/American Justice Podcast. Feel free to leave a comment, or you can message us on Messenger if you have a more pressing question or issue. If you would like to blog about the show, then you can log on to AmericanJusticePodcast.com and tell us what you think there. If you are a tweeter, you can also voice your opinion on Twitter at AJusticePodcast. If you would like to support the show, you can do so in a couple different ways. First, consider visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/AJPodcast. We have different levels of support that include t-shirts, guest call-in spots, and early access to our podcast and YouTube shows. Next, you can like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notifications of when we publish episodes. We would also very much appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review. If you have any comments about the show, or more importantly, any tips on the case we're discussing, please call 972-942-0444 and leave us a message. After all, if the subject of our podcast is innocent, that means someone out there is guilty. American Justice Army? Let's find them.